Oh, there we go. Please share this. Sure. Okay, so first of all, obviously having done, I did a book on this topic, which is why I'm up here. And one of the things that I was blown away by with this film, I mean, there was many things, but the sort of most obvious thing is the access that you guys got. You got the tapes. You didn't even, I was impressed enough that you got the daytime talk show tapes, let alone the actual tapes. So can you talk about how you got all the sources that you did for this movie?
Yeah, well, I am from Victoria, and I grew up 10 minutes down the road from Michelle and Larry. So this is the thing, when you're from a little small city and you actually have a real life boogeyman that lives in your town, you sort of, it's a weird childhood. And for access, when we started looking into this, you start with the book, right? The book, as you can sort of see in the movie. It is the origin story of the Satanic Panic. And in the back of the book, there's a list of names and the acknowledgements. And so if you're going to, make up a memoir and then put all these sources in the background that people can contact and be like, is this true? And including the family members, and that's sort of where we started. Because you probably saw this too. There's a lot of media coverage for Michelle Remembers, but the family never ever went on record. So this is the first time they told their story. Marilyn, Teresa, Cheryl, and it was such an honor for us to actually say, hey, listen, this is the other side of this story, and boy, is it ever fucked up.
And so how were you able to convince them to go on camera after not having, after them not having told this story for so long themselves?
I don't think convincing them was really that hard of a thing. I mean, there was a lot of people that we tried. Some people were more receptive, some people weren't. When Sean first contacted Marilyn, it was as though she hadn't skipped a day. He got on, he said, hey, I want to talk to you about the book. And they literally talked for an hour straight. She had everything all lined up. Marilyn has kept binders full of all of this stuff. She recorded anytime there was anything to do with repressed memory or anything to do with this on TV, she would record it. So she gave us 90 hours of archive. Melissa also did all the archive, and Melissa found everything else, and that was a wild tale in itself too.
But we had a treasure trove from Marilyn, who just recorded it off the TV, so yeah. VHS. So even, there's some things that people haven't seen since back then, because all of that stuff disappears, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that she had it was huge for us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And those tapes, let me tell you, there were 4 investigative teams in the 80s and 90s who looked into this, 2 from Canada, 1 from the US, 1 from the UK. No one got the tapes. Mm-hmm. So this is the first time people have actually heard this. And I know it's they literally took the transcripts and turned it into the book, but to actually get the tapes for us, and it was 2 tapes put on 1 cassette that somebody mailed to us anonymously.
Okay.
And it's this is the holy grail of the Satanic Panic that we managed to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hearing it for the first time was insane.
And we went wild.
Yeah. It's blood-curdling screams. It was way crazier than we had imagined,
Yeah. It's pretty terrifying in the movie, So I don't know if I feel like people here must have a million questions. So here's one right in the front.
I actually wanted to know how many hours of these sessions exist. How many hours of recordings of just Michelle's sessions?
600. Yeah.
They did it for 14 months and 6 hours at a time. They just accumulated an extraordinary amount of footage. Because Larry also was filming it as well. We couldn't get our hands on any of that, but they were doing the reel-to-reel and so recording all the audio.
Yeah, I was going to ask if he had filmed things because his wife talked about how he was always into every new technology and super into documenting things and stuff. So somewhere out there, there's actual video of the sessions.
Yeah.
Wow.
Michelle
tried.
probably burned them.
And so when you say you grew up down the street from them, did you literally grow up down the street from them?
I mean, in Victoria, it's 10 minutes down Cordova Bay Road.
Okay.
So this is like, literally they had this giant house overlooking the ocean, and then my
And so
family.
people knew like that's their house or whatever.
This is the thing, like, there's only so much that we could put in this film, but they were like, there's a gossip columnist in Victoria, that was the era that we lived in, and he wrote about them nonstop, because they just, like, you're not surprised, right? Like, it's like the doctor and the patient who got married and stayed in the city where this all happened, and she still lives there. Like, he died in Victoria, they never left. It is,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I know people had been looking for her for so long for other documentaries and stuff, and I know somebody that had found her at some point, and it was like through her church or something like that, but had never been able to get close to her at all, but it's just interesting to me that the Satanic Panic, like we think so much about Canada. I mean, we're really pioneers in a lot of things. And like the Satanic Panic, all started in Canada. But somebody else has some questions. Okay, we'll go here.
Just because like there's so many other threads with the Satanic Panic. You have the West Memphis 3, like heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, and all this other stuff. How do you decide what stayed in the movie and what went on the chopping room floor?
I think for us, after we kind of had our big, long, rough cut and looking at what we needed to do, we wanted to focus on the family. That's where we really thought the thread of the story really existed, and nobody had ever heard of this part. Nobody had ever stepped forward. None of the family members had ever spoken. So we really felt it was important to tell their side of the story, especially considering when you look at Michelle and Larry and you look at what they did to the world and how this exploded, it really affected all the lives within their family, and it like destroyed their family's lives. Like even talking to Teresa, you can tell like she's really affected by this. I'm not sure that she's fully ever healed from it. It took up the better part of 10 years of her life. So we thought it was really important to like focus on that part of the story and really make sure that we did their story justice.
Oh, yes. Glasses.
I really like the color palettes you chose in the film, and it was very reminiscent of actually documentaries in the 80s, I think. So was that a conscious choice of yours, especially with the reenactments?
Yeah, I mean, those reenactments, so when we were talking about the fact that Larry filmed these sessions early on when we were looking and investigating and researching, there was a photo we found in People magazine in 1980 that was a still from the film that Larry shot, and it was Michelle laying on the couch in the therapy office. And that for us was like, okay, here, the film exists. We can actually see what his office sort of looked like, at least the couch. And from there we could, talk about this. What do we want to do creatively? Work with a production designer to take that and recreate it and say, yeah, I know everyone's like, oh, recreations and documentaries sometimes. This is like, we could not find that video and we wanted to put this in, I'm glad you felt that way, because it's like we wanted it to feel like it was the missing piece that we couldn't get.
There was somebody that just there, yeah.
Oh yeah, hi. First of all, I could have watched like hours more of this. Like I would have sat here forever. But I was really interested in the the Vancouver police officer and the FBI officer, who were so grounded and practical in terms of looking at this whole thing. Did you ever talk with them, or did they ever talk about how that was so unique for so much law enforcement, and how a lot of this got so out of hand because of law enforcement's lack of looking things up like in yearbooks? Like I found that it was like I was surprised at how down to earth both of those people were in relation to like how widespread the like lack of insider curiosity was by so many other law enforcement. Did that ever come up when you were talking about them?
Oh yeah, I mean the lack of skepticism, specifically with both Ken and Charles are quite characters unto themselves. Charles was the first Wiccan police officer to come out as Wiccan in North America. Like I know it's like we said we should make another film called Witch Cop with him.
Witch Cop.
Like to do. But that at the time, it was a big deal, right? Like you saw Cops for Christ. He was actually out there and he would go speaking around North America, talking to these different police forces, and you have to get in front of 400, 500, 1,000 cops to say, listen, I'm Wiccan. I'm not a Satanist. This is a real religion. This is my belief system. You shouldn't actually, the satanic panic's not real. He had to do this over and over and over again for 15 years, and same with Ken Lanning too. Like he was in charge of the occult, Satanism, and everything else. And he did that, this is 20 years of these folks' lives that they actually they stood up and said, this is a lie, when no one else would, which is impressive.
Yeah, and one of the major things about the Satanic Panic was the sort of rise of the experts, the experts in quotes, because there were so many people, because there was no background or knowledge or anything, that there'd just be somebody going, I'm an expert, put me on your talk show. Or you can write a book that's complete bullshit, but because you wrote a book, now you're the expert that everybody uses because you wrote a book. And I feel like during that era, that just flourished so much, where so many of these people after the fact, all these people who had written books and who were experts and who were, Key McFarlane, who's working with the kids at McMartin and all this stuff, they had no background in any of the stuff that they were doing, and I feel like that it's so dangerous, how easily that kind of thing happens, I feel like it happens even on much more innocuous levels, but it's just but just how quickly somebody can insinuate themselves into a situation as a so-called expert of something. And I liked that your film dealt a lot with that too, and also just at the very beginning of the film, where they're talking about how connected it was to all the stuff that was happening around kids, because when I was doing the Satanic Panic book, our book was very focused on pop culture, but so we went in with all Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal and stuff, and halfway through the project we were so depressed because we're oh my god, this is just all about child molesting, it was just so depressing, the actual details of the Satanic Panic, and that it was not this funny pop cultural thing from the 80s. It was super heavy and had destroyed so many people's lives and stuff. But yeah, so I felt like your film, even though it has this very case-specific focus, it really handled a lot of the other elements of the Satanic Panic really well. Somebody had brought up, deciding what's going to go in the movie or not. And I felt that you guys did a good job of bringing a lot of stuff in while still staying really focused on your topic, But okay, just yes, you.
I just was wondering. There seemed to be a lot of people that that you interviewed that didn't come outright and say this was an intentional fraud. But I just wondered, with all the exposure that you had to all the content, all the actual tapes, did you ever get the impression from any of these people, off camera or not, or your own impressions, whether or not Pastor and Michelle came up with this as an intentional fraud to sell a book, or whether it was just two people that had this experience and it came out like this? They may have realized it later on, but at the beginning it was authentic. Or was it just an outright fraud?
No, I think it was authentic. Larry really believed it. This is what he was focused on, and he was so religious, and he just believed that this stuff was happening. He found Michelle at a very vulnerable time. I think over time they probably realized something was up, and he was chasing fame, she was chasing him. They created this whole lie, and once you're stuck in this lie, how do you get out of this lie? So you just exist in the lie. I think that's really what captured them, and that's what really brought them together. And I mean, Teresa says it well, and it's just it's the book that really tied them together, and there was just no way of getting out of it after the train had already left the station.
Though if I can add to this, I mean, I interviewed, you see the people you saw in the film, and I had 40 phone interviews with a bunch of other folks, childhood friends of Michelle, a woman that lived with Michelle when she was in her early 20s and started seeing Larry in 1972, for the 4 years before they wrote the book. There were ghostwriters who worked with them. There was the publisher in New York who was actually the editor for Jaws. So, you know what I mean? And then you start going, the publicists that worked with them on the book tour. I have a different perspective than Steve, and I don't know. I have to be honest, right? Like you hear it, and there's some of that stuff where it's only one person saying this and you can't actually put it in a documentary. I'm skeptical.
Just thank you, because I love the fact that both of you who are the makers of this film have differing views. So it just talks to the mystique of the content. So congratulations, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, yes.
You sort of touched upon it a bit in the end, the comparison with what's happening right now with fake news and QAnon and this sort of remix of the Satanic Panic. Have you previously considered exploring that more and also comparing the two different situations, because what has changed compared to now compared to the 80s, for example?
How much money do you have?
That was one of the main things when we premiered at South by. The main feedback that came back was people just wanted more. They wanted us to dive into like all the little crevices that exist within the film, and so we are actively exploring it and seeing if we can't turn it into something a little bit longer. Because I mean, it's 10 years worth of content that you could really like dive into.
But also, when you guys first talked to me about the movie, the Michelle and Larry story you see today was a lot smaller, and there was a lot more of that stuff, but I think you guys just found this deserved its own movie and kind of shrunk all that stuff way down. And I think that was a good call.
Yeah.
Weren't there any investigations on the fact that there were no missing babies?
You know, it's like a funny thing with conspiracy theories, right? So like the lack of evidence is evidence. And it didn't even matter, right? It didn't matter that there were no, and then they were like, you know, as the conspiracy kept growing, there were like crematoriums that were put on semi-trucks that were driving around the US who were burning the babies' bodies so no one could ever find them. And then their ashes people ate and you couldn't find the ashes. And
Baby wax.
And you turn them into candles.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about the cases of the teachers and the people who were accused. Like, I find it hard to understand how it went that far if it was completely made up. I know it wasn't addressed in the film because you had to remove stuff, but like, can you address that?
Yeah, I think it was like a weird feedback loop because the rumors start, like the book's out there, so people begin to talk about it. It's in the churches, people are talking about it. Eventually it reaches the daytime talk shows, they're talking about it. All of a sudden it's on the news. So like it just reinforces this idea that it is happening. And I think it just created this whole thing that like just took on a whole, it was a beast of its own. And there was just no getting around it because it was just this thing that everybody was talking about. And like the police believed it, the psychiatrists were talking about it. Like there was just no escaping it. So it was just in the ether.
How do they accuse, who brings together that evidence? Was it just these fake quack psychologists going to people and saying, we want to talk to your kid? Like, how do they come up with those stories?
You sort of you see it a little bit with the McMartin case, and it's like, you know, that's almost its own movie in itself, but in the way that those counselors and therapists were using puppets and asking leading questions to actually, again and again, to the children to get them to actually finally say what they're looking for.
Because they believe it.
Yeah. And and the police did that as well. And I mean, you see this over and over again still if you've watched Making a Murderer on Netflix. It's the same techniques that happened during the Satanic Panic that happened in that case as well and happened over and over again. It's just this weird, I shouldn't say it's weird, it's just terrible and tragic and
it's human nature.
Yeah.
It's hysteria. And I think the parents had a lot to do with it too. Mm-hmm. So the parents hearing about that, asking their kid, did this happen to you? Kid's like, no. Maybe the fifth time, like, okay, maybe it did. And then it snowballs, right?
And then a lot of those teachers, you know, a big portion of them were queer. And a lot of the people who did face these accusations were members of the queer community, or they were single women who didn't have kids, who were teaching other people's kids or working in daycares and looking after people's
Witch trials.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you have to look at people's agendas, you know, going in. It's like all these people have their own agendas, and there was also very much an agenda, and it's there even in Michelle Remembers, even though that's not a daycare case, but it's very much this thing of like what happens when a single woman gives her child to someone else to take care of the child, you know, and it's like this backlash against women working, you know, and giving their children to someone else to take care of because it goes against the family values that were coming back in the early 80s, in the Reagan era, you know? And so there's all these people that have different types of agendas that are feeding into each other and supporting each other, you know? And, you know, the reason why we call the 80s the Satanic Panic is because, as you say, that's the era when, you know, because for people who are Christian, the Satanic Panic never ended, you know? It's like, it's all the time. But for you know, the reason that era is called the Satanic Panic is because everybody believed it. You know, like my mom wouldn't let us use Crest toothpaste because it was made by Procter and Gamble.
Yeah.
You know, and they were supposedly Satanists. So I mean, it was like everybody, regardless of whether they were churchgoers and stuff like this, all bought into it. And then, like you say, it just became this like rolling hysteria. But oh yeah.
Thank you. First of all, just a thanks to the filmmakers for the enormous effort that you put into this. It's such an important piece of documentation. I wanted to ask, and I would welcome hearing from anyone or everyone on the panel, while you were working on the film, did you come to a perspective of your own about the psychology of belief that primed the audiences themselves to accept all this material with such a lack of scrutiny?
I feel like what I was saying before, it was everywhere. Like, it was so ingrained in pop culture. Religious horror was gigantic at the time. The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, like everywhere you looked, it was just there. And religion was so much more popular in the 80s. So there just wasn't any. You just couldn't get away from it. Like, it was always there. People were always talking about it, and so it was something that was like really easy to believe because it was everywhere. I don't really know, like, can you speak to that?
Mine's a little, you know, like, hey, why does my life suck? Well, the economy, oh yeah, there's this whole history of oppression for different minorities. So like, you can go through these, or my father is terrible, or my mother, you know, whatever you want to say, because of her grandmother, or, you know, on and on and on. That's really complicated. You know what's really easy? Satan, right? That's what's, like, when you want to scapegoat somebody, usually it's somebody who's not part of the mainstream culture, somebody who's a little bit outside, might be a little weird. That's the easy person to blame for all your problems in life, and that's what you sort of saw in the film.
Yeah, people want to believe. They wanted to latch onto something. It supports their values and their value system to believe this. So it gives them something to believe this. So I think that, and it encourages them to keep believing it. That's what I think.
I'm not familiar with your other work, but what drove you to talk about that one subject in particular for this film? I know it probably has to do with the fact that you live in Victoria, but apart from that, was it something else that sparked an interest in that subject at that moment?
You know, for starters, there's never been a documentary done on Michelle Remembers, and it's, you know, this book that sold millions of copies and was a bestseller. And for me, it's sort of like you watch other films about the Satanic Panic or series or podcasts, and they all mention it. There's usually one line, oh yeah, there's this patient and the doctor and Michelle Remembers, and that was part of the Satanic Panic's beginning. No one had ever gone into it and actually looked at, was it Michelle, was it Larry? And I'm not sure if we answered that question either. That last scene in the film for us is sort of, for me, why I wanted to make it. Hearing that specific audio in the therapy tapes where she's basically asking, is this real? Is she asking it to get permission from Larry to actually say, yeah, I made this all up? Or is she actually can't tell if it's real, or, you know what I mean? Like, this is like this gray area in this story that we really wanted to dive into.
Yeah, and in 2018 is when the book kind of came back into our life, and at that time, that's when Pizzagate and QAnon was happening, and we really saw the correlation between the two, and we were like, this is really interesting. So like when we realized that nobody had done anything on it, we thought it was like a really like a juicy topic, and we wanted to take it on.
Plus, we worship Satan.
Yes.
I'm wondering, you must have spoken really long time to Teresa. Did she ever mention what Michelle had to say for herself? Did they ever like discuss it?
It was hard, both Teresa and Marilyn. I mean, there's only so much you can put in about the stories they had about what it was like to live with Michelle, not only when, the affair started, but afterwards, when, you see her at Christmas dinner every year, right? She comes to the wedding of Marilyn's kids, has to be invited, and then, they would tell us this joke, like, please pass the salt, bride of Satan. Like, what do you say at Christmas dinner to Michelle? But yeah, like, we had to be selective. There's a bunch of other things that both of them told us and the three brothers, that Michelle showing up at their house and what that was actually like during the 70s. Like, it is, we could only put in about 3 of that, but it just went on and on and on for 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah, white shirt.
First thing, I just find that the editing was really nice. Like, I loved how much, like, sometimes there were bits, like, that were even humorous in the way things were edited, or, like, the one that came to mind was, like, the police officer that said, oh, yeah, children disappeared, but it's unfortunate we just can't find bodies, and it's just there, like, for a second. It's clever. I like it, and I think it was like just very funny. But as a question, I wanted to know, because you said the movie was made also in the perspective of like the families that's who it's for, and I was just curious to know if they've seen the documentary and what they think about it.
Yeah, they've all seen it. They're happy with it. They're happy that like their side has been told. Cheryl's really proud of it. I think that they're finally, their side has been told. Their truth has been told, and I think that they're just really happy that they were able to finally do it.
It was cathartic, I think, for them.
And Blanche Barton of the Church of Satan is very happy with it.
Yes.
All right, do we have one last question? All right, in the back.
You mentioned something about the brothers, but I don't remember seeing any remarks from brothers.
This too is sort of in the 40 interviews and emails and the people that we reached out to. I think they are in some of the photos, and especially the childhood photos when Teresa's talking about her family in Victoria. Those are the boys, and we talked to them just to make sure that this was okay, and they helped fact check what Marilyn and Teresa said, and said, this is true, and I'll sign a letter for it. And it's a family effort, I will tell you that.
They didn't want to be filmed, or?
No, they didn't want to participate on camera.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
The film opens theatrically in Canada across 12 cities August 11th. It'll have dates until the end of August, and then we have some more news coming up soon.
All right, and they can follow your website?
Yeah, saintwansi.com. saintwansifilm.com.
Instagram. All right, thanks everybody.